All right, never mind.
So, Dan, just to start, would you tell us a little bit about, how you got to here? The quick Cliff Notes resume of
sure.
how you landed here.
So hi everyone, thanks for having me. So basically, starting right now, Empathetic Media is a multimedia VR and AR production studio based out of Dumbo in Brooklyn, and in a lot of ways, it draws on my previous my former and yet current career as well as a graphic journalist. So I previously used comics and visual illustrated journalism to tell news stories. And in a lot of ways, for me, what drove that was the idea of agency and having users or readers, civilians, making stories out of a series of sequential images and being able to also navigate those spaces without too much cognitive dissonance. So the idea being that you could have juxtaposed narratives or contradictory testimony or eyewitness statements, and because it's not set up in a linear fashion, because you can have images side by side or arranged in a pattern, that they can jump either time periods or from perspectives in a way that wasn't quite so disconcerting. It didn't sort of derail the narrative. And I was always interested in the narrative mechanics of video game design, and I think that, to be honest, a lot of the most compelling stories are actually being told in that format. And I'm still amazed that there aren't more non-fictional stories being told, or like journalistic applications. I mean, now that we're in it, I can tell you, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why that's happened. But I think now that the tools for creating VR are so much more accessible and affordable and free in a lot of cases, we're entering this golden age, really, where with the ability and the tools to match the storytelling ambitions are finally sort of reaching a level point. So I think now is the perfect time to do it. The real challenge, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is doing it, being able to turn around like minimum viable product or like proof of concepts in a way that's both affordable and like common sense.
Yeah. That's a good moment to kind of move in. How do you define a VR project, and then similarly, how do you define an AR project?
So it's funny. I think virtual reality is a term that is often abused. People are using it sort of synonymously with 360 video. I see them as very separate. So as I'm sure you'll know, 360 video, it's full head-mounted, well, it doesn't have to be head-mounted, but it's full freedom of movement, but you're effectively still a camera. Whereas virtual reality, as I understand it, sort of dictionary definition, is it's an environment that's digitally created, so it's virtual, obviously, but it interacts. Your interactions with the environment cause it to change in time, in like. So in the same, what that means effectively is it has to be 3D explorable and navigational. So it's not just a flat amount of depth that you can get, and in addition to that, it's objects and interactivity. So that level of immersion, I think, is so much greater and heightened. But as people have already said as well, there is sort of other steps within VR. So you can have, for example, pre-rendered VR, where it's effectively like a baked video sphere. So you just have a movie that is projected, like in the Unity game engine, for example, onto a sphere, and you can still look around. That's sort of faking the 360 idea. Or you can have real-time, VR, where we were just talking about like room scale VR, where it's tracking your body and you can actually move through it. Google's Project Tango has toyed with that. And then what we do at Empathetic is we try and make really affordable, accessible VR. So we build on like the Google Cardboard framework predominantly, and we use movement through the button. So the user controls movement throughout the space, even though they are themselves not physically moving. And I mean, we can talk about the UX separately. As much for augmented reality, I think that's the idea that you're effectively taking very similar assets, but you're positioning them on top of a real world space. So often through the camera view of a device. Mixed reality as well allows you to sort of segue between the two. So, for example, it would be something that's you can hold your device up to your face, and if you look down, it does the augmented reality, so it superimposes the image on top of a 3D space. Or you look up, and it's full VR. And so, there's still I think a wide range of definitions of it.
That makes sense. So, when you are trying to sort of pick a project, what do you look for in a pitch that someone gives you or a story that you're reading that makes you think this is going to make for something I can really do great work with in the virtual space?
So probably the best example is the Ferguson piece. That was really the sort of our first foray into this. I was in Missouri. I was 2 hours away from Ferguson when Michael Brown was fatally shot in August of 2014. And I mean, I guess cutting straight to the chase, I would say space. So in a sense, the spatialized aspect of the story has to really be at the fore in order for you to warrant using 3 dimensions. In a lot of ways, by setting it as a stage and by thinking of it almost in a theatrical sense, it can really help facilitate both the user's journey through it and the way that you're going to structure the narrative. So in the case of Ferguson, there was so much focus on the protest and you know, I felt that although Ferguson and Florissant Avenue themselves became great players in it, I actually wanted to get to the more sort of Rashomon-esque, to quote, you know, Kurosawa, and get to the point of, right, so we have one fixed space that everyone can agree on, and we have a series of different cameras or perspectives within that space. So how can I represent all of those without just doing a play-by-play, like, you know, here's what person A saw, here's what person B saw, here's what person C saw. Because as we know from analytics, human nature, I think not only are people more prejudiced and inherently biased towards the first few that they would see,
right,
but they're also less likely to even make it to, say, the 15th perspective that you show. So what I wanted to do is essentially build on that idea of agency that I mentioned before and give people the means to be able to effectively move through the space. So you start off at a way back from where Officer Wilson's cruiser was stopped, basically where Dorian Johnson was effectively stopped, and who was accompanying Michael Brown at the time of the shooting. And you can choose. So there are 3 sort of beacons, 3 types of beacons within the scene. You have numbered beacons, which correspond to the different eyewitnesses that were effectively their location and testimony came out with the FOIA request from the grand jury trial. Right. And then you have evidence beacons. So those are, again, they bring up 2-dimensional photos of the evidence materials, such as Michael Brown's hat, 2 of his, you know, flip-flop, his sandals that came off as he ran, Wilson's shell casings, and the third were additional. In addition to the audio, there are actually 3D models. So as you moved into the audio and you heard these beacons, you saw 3D representations of effectively in tandem with what you were hearing. I originally also had comics, which was my way around not doing the models, but the models were the best way to do it. So in the final build, that's what we incorporated.
And just to kind of do a side note here, I think this speaks a lot to, you know, when Denise and I were doing the critiques of your original pitches, one of the things that kept coming up is this space, does the space warrant doing 3D video? So right. I think it's a sort of a similar problem here. Like I said, they're cousins in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
That space is so critical to determining whether it's worth doing it.
And the same, yeah, I mean, I think that you've got to think about focal points, points of interest, right? It's interesting, you know, I'm talking at the Magnum Foundation later, you know, in a couple of weeks, and it's basically getting the same, applying the same sort of framework with photographers who are obviously masters of composition and point of interest, but how do you, like, what warrants this sort of approach? And I feel that it's the user's movement through the space. Like, we have a little slogan, it's like stories that move you, that you move as well. And so it's the idea that by interacting with the environment, that inherently ties a closer bond. It forces you to lose yourself more immersively in the story. And I think I've seen so many 360 videos where 2D, you know, the standard 2D tracking shot or a standard close-up on someone's face, you know, interviews are, you know, famously quite difficult in 3D space because by dint of stitching, you can't be so close to someone, right. And similarly, there's no point looking behind you because there's nothing there. So, yeah, I think those are big concerns.
There was a really interesting conversation. Dan and I were just talking a second ago. So I was just out in San Francisco for the Facebook Developers Conference, and they talked a lot about sort of 3D video or 360 video and sort of the qualities that it shares. And one of the filmmakers who was on stage being interviewed said that the thing that people forget about a space that's around you is that there's still a front to the space.
Right.
Right? Even as you have the ability to look behind you, there's still going to be a focal point or a point of interest or something that you want to direct the reader to.
And that's really what I learned in Ferguson. So in the first build, it was completely open world. It was like a sandbox. And a lot of the original user testers came back and said, well, what's the point? What do I do? You know, and I didn't want to guide them or lead them. I said, you know, just have at it. You know, you have X many minutes, please just explore. And a lot of them felt very constrained by that. This borrows a lot on, like I said, video game design, but a lot. You want to make sure that the driving force, and we often forget this, in like a 3-act structure, there's a spark that sort of generates that movement through story that is the conduit. And as soon as the narrator, or the viewer rather, is aware of the conceit, and sort of, I guess, you break that fourth wall, there's that risk of losing them. So in the Ferguson environment, a lot of people were like, oh, I must be doing this wrong. And then that's the worst state that you want to get people in. So we eventually added, for example, like glowing beacons and then arrows that sort of breadcrumbed people from beacon to beacon if they wanted a particularly guided experience. And some of the cues, obviously, in 360 video, you want to use audio for that. The most successful 360 videos that I've seen actually directly reference it in the audio. So you have people say, look to your right, and then as you do that, it's almost like, excellent, what you can see here is, you know, or similarly, like, do you see that person in the background? Follow where they're going, because it's almost like you're faking the agency of the user, like you're giving them something to do, but you're not explicitly making it obvious that they're being led. So, I mean, someone was saying that it's not show, don't tell, it's like discover, don't force in 360.
We've talked a lot about adding narration and what that can add to your video when you sort of hear voices telling you about the space or drawing your interest to something.
Yeah.
So since we've been talking about Ferguson, I'm sort of curious on 2 levels. So one, I'd love to hear how long Ferguson took. And then I am curious if, having worked on that in some other projects, if you sort of have a minimum time that you feel you can pull off a virtual project in.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ferguson, as I said, by its very nature, was sort of inherently experimental. Our first build, so it happened in August, and I took a sort of a very prosaic demo walkthrough to Owner, which was at the end of September. So that was like a proof of concept, and we were using tools like Google Earth, Google SketchUp. You know, you can build these very prosaic models on top of satellite imagery. That was obviously the first concern. Like, are these realistic, and do they geographically are they accurate? Then we did a new build. So the piece was actually published by Fusion in December of 2014, and that had as much information as had come out by that point. But then there was the grand jury trial, which effectively culminated around that time. And then we had to add in so there was a huge build after that point, because we needed to effectively hire voice actors to voice all the different testimonies, and then the 3D modeling. So then the actual next build that was more finished came out in March of 2015. So that was a lot of stopping and starting, predominantly because we didn't have all the assets to begin with. You know, our current project is on the Colombian conflict, and we're effectively applying a very similar framework, whereby it's one single narrative thread, but taken from the 2 opposing sides, the leftist FARC guerrillas and the right-wing paramilitaries, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, and then the civilians in the middle. And so that was more straightforward, quote unquote, if you can describe a VR project like that, because I did the interviews and I knew I had the narratives and I knew I needed to do that. So again, to answer your question, we try and pull it down to between 6 to 8 weeks for a VR immersive experience, but it all depends on the number of interactions in the scene, the number of players, the number of characters in that scene, and our access to the scene. So, for example, obviously in Colombia, I was there and I took as much as I could at the time, but the biggest advantage, excuse me, is your access to the scene and the ability to go back, like gather more evidence, because you always forget something, and you always, you know.
So that kind of leads into my last question about this, which you hit on earlier, which is, you know, at the end you always think, oh, if I could go back and do this differently, I would change this.
Right.
So what are some of those lessons that you've learned?
Good Lord. Right. I would say the script, obviously the script, quote unquote, the story is so imperative. There is nothing more important than that. And it is very easy to succumb to the danger of, this is really cool tech, I'm going to start building out the fun stuff. So I'm going to start getting into the scanning, I'm going to start getting into the textures, I'm going to start, you know, we work with a rotating cadre of 3D artists and game developers, and starting them on something, and then, of their evidence coming out. So when, for example, we had to reset some of the beacons in Ferguson, obviously it was very frustrating to them because they had built an infrastructure, like an architecture within the piece, and then suddenly we said, oh, so now we're not doing just comics, we need this. And so being aware of what the mechanics of your piece are, like basically like making a paper prototype version of your piece, totally analog, that is clear to you, that someone can walk through, that will save you days, weeks of pain in the end. Because once, obviously, you invest so much in a digitally built version, it's much harder to go into the weeds and unpick it. I would also think about, user test as much as you can, if that's possible. It's also very easy when you're making these sort of intense exploratives that you're sort of snowblind because you've been with it so long that it's second nature to you to do that and then do that. And I gave it to someone, for example, I'm doing it in tandem with the International Voices of Hope Foundation. They're a restorative narrative, primarily restorative journalism foundation based out of Poynter. And so Jackie Banazinski, the Pulitzer Prize winner, she's like tutoring us. Yeah. And she's, actually I don't know how old she is, but she's not of a video gaming generation. And I gave it to her and she was just like lost. No. In the first one she was like, I just didn't know what to do, Dan. Like, was I supposed to move? What am I seeing? How am I making sense? And so that was great. Don't just give it to your peers, give it to like your parents, give it to like a wide cross section, because once it's out there, you never know who's gonna open it up. And so UX is really, really critical. And there's actually a great piece that a Knight fellow, actually, Katie Newton, just did, and she actually did with the Knight Foundation, sort of analog user testing and audience testing with VR. So they actually got like Google Cardboards, took the lenses out, and then had actors appear in scene. And there were little things like, for example, and I call this like the Chekhov's gun phenomenon. Like when you're making a scene or you're shooting 360, the viewer naturally fixates on what's close to them, and they assume there is inherent meaning in that proximity, even if you've just left. So Phoebe's jacket is right there, right? But in a 360 shot, you'd think, oh, so has someone left hurriedly, or why is that there? Or like, what's the difference? Is that supposed to contrast with the emptiness of this room? And their mind goes just wild. And so she did this test where she left cookies very close, and then in another shot they were further away, and people kept saying, I was trying to get the cookie. What was the symbolism of the cookie? And they just left it there. So it's just
right. That everything in your shot sort of ends up taking on meaning.
Takes on meaning, yeah.
That's great. That's great. What keeps you excited about doing VR and AR journalism?
I would say, and I don't mean this in a pointed way, but I think the fact that no one's got it quite right yet, I think is really exciting. I'm like I said, I particularly think that the potential for CG, especially as we're that technology is what's really going to improve. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen like Lightro's cinema camera, which is insane with how much data it produces. I think it's 750 megas a second or a frame. It's insane. But so like light field capture, that sort of technological advancement, we'll begin to see how that plays into the idea of these virtually created spaces. But I also think that there's still 360 video is still very much in its sort of embryonic novel stage right now. And as I said, I think stringing together sequences is still a massive problem. Like people have done the fade in, fade out. People have done the teleport idea. But there's so many more ways we can do it. And I think in a lot of ways, actually, organizations like Riot or Verse or whoever know that there's just this window, because as soon as the deal-breaking, the better version of the Ricoh Theta comes out and UGC content comes out, then there will be countless other, contenders for the 360 crown. And I think that'll be a really exciting time. I mean, I personally think that game engines are really where it's at, just because they do play so well with spherical video and spherical photography and 3D assets. And so, in particular, now that the reason I'm so excited is that we have this dangerously symbiotic relationship with our smartphones, and that's like our gateway drug straight into this space. Whereas with VR, it's a harder sell, because obviously you have to put stuff on your face and isolate yourself. I think I've seen a lot more people having what they call the magic pane or the magic window experience, And I think that's, so we have the tech, it is affordable, it's just, it's intense, the workflow, but it's doable, and people have these content delivery devices on them all the time in a specific capacity, so I think it's like a perfect storm.
I like it. Well, last question, and then we'll turn it over to them
Sure.
for questions. But when you want inspiration or you're trying to sort of get a fresh perspective, where do you look?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think a lot of great work is coming out of organizations like Sundance and Tribeca. Storyscapes is coming out this weekend in New York. It's funny because it's a double-edged sword. I think a lot of the work that happens there is incredible and innovative and groundbreaking, but it is for that film festival crowd.
Right.
And so, some of the work that we've done, yes, it's not as sophisticated in the graphical sense, but that's because we're deliberately trying to, as we were talking about, trying to deploy to mobile.
Right.
So I think I look to those, but I also think, and frankly, I still think the most ingenious, incredibly entertaining and engaging narratives are coming out of like the indie game scene. Lucas Pope's Papers, Please, which was a game. It's nothing to do with VR or 360, but it was like a game where you become a customs agent and you have to filter out like you're basically at an airport at a fictionalized entry points to a country, and you have to ascertain who are the threats and who you can and can't let through.
Nice.
And there are just a lot of people playing around. I still think that Last of Us, for example, which is a zombie survival game, cinematically, how it's telling stories and the way it's developing character and allowing you to play through character is fascinating. Like at the Magnum talk that I mentioned, 1979 is a video game that was just released by he did all the mocap for Grand Theft Auto 5, Navid Konsari, his name is, and this is a video game version of the Iranian Revolution. It's on Steam now. It's really powerful, using a ton of interviews and archival footage. You play as this character. There's a bunch of, and it's sort of like what's that game? The Telltale Games, The Walking Dead, what's it called? Somebody help me out here.
I think it's Walking Dead.
The Walking Dead. I think it is The Walking Dead. Okay, thanks. And so basically, it's like multiple choice. So you're being interrogated, and you can choose to comply or not, and then characters show whether or not so and so heard you. And so it's just that idea of implying immersive storytelling. It doesn't have to just be in the field of view.
Well, that's what I have, but I want to hear your questions.
Okay, so David and I are working on a thing. We're trying to figure out how to do 360 audio, kind of like spatial audio.
Yeah.
Binaural, whatever the word is for it. We're trying to figure that out in Unity, and like we've noticed recently how Cardboard has released, Google's released a thing kind of to help develop that, like iOS and whatnot. And basically, wondering like if you have any like ideas of what we should do. We're having a lot of trouble trying to figure out in like how to create this space in Unity. And
yeah, sure. We've just used the Unity Sound Mixer. Now has 3D spatial audio built in. That's been pretty robust. Using sound spheres. There's also a plugin you might check out by VisiSonics, V-I-S-I Sonics. That's free, I believe. But on the whole, I generally use like the Unity Sound Mixer and the editor. Specific use case.
The room just went dark here.
Yeah, nice.
Turn the lights back on.
About the specific use cases as well of like which instances when you're trying to get sound to play. How would is it that you're trying to get sound to sound really distant, or you know what I mean, or is it sounds appearing behind you, or
yeah, more directional, like as you turn, like if somebody's over here talking, the audio is coming from just that direction.
Fades in or out. Yeah. Sometimes just tweaking the tolerance control, I think, on the audio can make a big difference. But on the whole, I've just used the curving graph in the sound editor. Yeah, I've just played with that a lot.
Okay. Do you use exclusively Unity for that kind of stuff, or do you use other programs?
No, just Unity. Yeah, I mean we're actually doing a just to compare and contrast. We're playing around with Unreal on the latest.
If you'd done that.
Yeah, on the latest one, just to see how it works. And frankly, the lighting, I think, and in terms of like the pre-baked settings that it has, are more beautiful to look at. But I think it is expressly designed for deployment to higher-end PCs, so it's less mobile friendly. But Unity, you know, and its ability to deploy anywhere, and particularly like with its WebGL component, I think is really, really great. Not to mention the asset store. I mean, that thing is just a gold mine with the free assets alone, and the baked-in, you know, the standard assets pack that comes with it is pretty great. I would say I would exercise very much caution. We were talking before about interactives that break, but the Ferguson original desktop version was published through the Unity web player, which Chrome then abandoned helpfully soon after. So we had to tell people to do it on Firefox, and you know, the whole palaver. And so, yeah, just I would think about trying to do as much stuff in like WebGL or browser-based stuff as you can.
Have you tried experimenting the same thing in like LumberYard or anything, like any other open source?
Yeah, I haven't. No, I haven't. I mean, it's true. I haven't. No, I haven't looked at LumberYard yet. But it's also like I find that I feel like there's another package that comes out every week, you know, and so we're just getting you know, with a Unity Cloud solution as well. You can, you know, in GitHub, it's like it seems like a good framework unless something really breaks or unless I see a really compelling reason behind it. That and the size and sort of scale of the community, I think, make it pretty good as a decision to use. But other products are available.
Yeah.
I see you over there in the corner.
Wow. Coming over.
Just a hand. Hey.
Hi.
Hi.
So I've seen your Ferguson project before. I was just wondering, like, when you have an idea like that, how do you even start the process of getting in contact with developers, and how do you just like make that happen, really? So cool.
You just write off a huge chunk of your life, basically.
I'm speaking journalistic, guys.
Yeah, there you go. Well, so, I mean, yeah, it was a while coming. I mean, I couldn't have done Ferguson without the Reynolds journalism support. It was a great place to be able to experiment, and now we have got more of a framework. But it is, I mean, frankly, the hardest thing, I would say, a project manager or having someone that is meticulous in managing the different stages is so critical, particularly to your budget, because if you get a developer involved, then they'll be chomping at the bit, and if you start them off working on a problem or a project and then pivot, and you risk losing them. And let me tell you, like, we've had people walk out mid-project, and having someone come back in, it's like, you know, it would be like getting someone in to finish someone else's story. And so, particularly when it comes to like the cleanliness or efficiency of the code, yeah, you want to be really careful about that. So I would say set tight deadlines. Set tight deadlines. Be very aware of the assets that you have, and like, you know, like do an inventory and be very clear about that. Be very upfront and check in regularly with your developers and just like brief them on like what's happening if they hit roadblocks, that sort of thing. And I don't know, or user test, like be very careful. So the thing I learned about Ferguson is that what might be incredible and genre-defying in your head might not necessarily work for 99% of the population. So that's really why you want to do the paper prototyping and get people to see if this is a use case that is actually going to be beneficial or usable or, you know, even functional, you know. So
if I can add two things in there which might be helpful to think about when you're trying to collaborate on a project. One is, I think, and this is sort of to the like really setting out your guidelines, but be clear about what you absolutely have to have versus what's a nice to have.
Yeah.
That there's things that you have to be willing to sort of shed when it gets really down. You never want to lay out a project where you have to have absolutely everything that's on your list, right? There always has to be something that can fall away. You hope it doesn't, but there's the flexibility built in there. And I think the other thing that you might think about, you know, particularly if you're bringing one set of skills to the table, let's say you're the writer or the reporter or the shooter, be willing to let the other person bring some creativity into that project, right? Especially when you're talking about developing good relationships. You know, I had Emily Chow come in and talk to you all earlier, and one of the things we talk about a lot is that in the newsroom, people will just bring her projects and be like, okay, build it, and I want it to look like this, and like this, and like this, and like this. And then like all she's doing is building something for someone else, as opposed to being able to have a dialogue, right? Saying, hey, here's the idea that I think I have. I love your thoughts, and I'd really like to work with you on it, right? And her ideas or your developer's ideas will change that. But then that also means they're invested in the project in a way that they won't be if all they're doing is executing on your vision. And
it'll also keep it from going stale as well. If you stuck to the original vision, then you'll be pretty bored with it by the end. And I would say, yeah, I certainly probably, if I have my developers in front of me, they'd probably tell you a completely different story. But so I think the thing that I'm most guilty of is when I say, oh, it would be so cool if we could just do that. And then, you know, and I have a bazillion ideas, and they're like, okay, but, you know, it does this right now. How much do you want that? Basically what you're saying. And sometimes you need to be able to step back and say, okay, so I don't need you to focus all your attention on this one thing because you think it'll look pretty cool. Like, you need to just get the basic, you know, this part working, because that's the most, that's like that's the core of it. You know, it's very easy to be sidetracked by more superficial details or things like that.
Also, how many people would you say, like an estimate, are involved in developing something like this? How many people do you have to kind of persuade or talk to and keep together, basically?
From the production side, or in general, like including different
the production side.
Yeah, it was. What do you think? Yeah, about seven or eight, of varying different levels engagement. I mean, it would be hoped that you would be like the through line, right? That hopes that does this all the way through, and that, I mean, what's imperative, like anything really, is that you need the primary source materials. You need to have that first-hand experience. I would really caution against trying to do any sort of 3D environmental-based exploration without having gone there, because it'll be very clear that your understanding of the space and everything like that, and the materials that you need and whatever, it will fall short. So I would say you probably need one person. I was one person working full time on it, and then I had maybe two people who worked sort of semi, like I call it sort of part time, and then sort of contractors who did like some of the modeling, for example.
Also, one more question: how much did it cost to do something like this, and how do you assemble the money for these big time kind of collaborative projects?
Well, that in a nutshell is the silver bullet of VR. I think that's the trouble, or rather the challenge. It is trying to get buy-in with the most minimal viable product before you can then pull the trigger and take it to like full scale. So again, I had the Reynolds support, so I was able to work on this like that. I mean, I was also teaching and working on other projects, so it wasn't just like one full sprint. And similarly now, you know, we do AR as well as VR. But we try and, like I say, we try and keep it down to like a eight week time frame. That's running quickly as well. And in terms of budget, again, it sort of depends, you know. Ferguson, in the end, it had like 80 panels, 80 hand-drawn panels, so comics that were drawn into it, probably about 50 3D models that I hand-posed. We had voice actors. So, well, if you incorporate the voice actors, that's another, you know, I had TAs at work. So it all, I mean, I would probably say it's more like, yeah, of everyone involved, it's probably like 8 to 10. But in terms, you can do it on a shoestring budget, but it just, as long as people understand, you know, that the assets or the experience might just be more low poly, you know what I mean? Like you can cut corners. Like my original ambition for it was to map the whole of Ferguson, and you were going to start actually at the cigar, at the store where he supposedly took the swishes, and then literally walk down. You would walk down Florissant Avenue, you would pass the burning Quick Trip, then you would take a right and go down Canfield Green Apartments, and then you would get to the scene of the shooting. but that's just totally unfeasible with the amount, the sort of size of the model. So do yourself a big favor. It's almost like the Oculus demo scene. Like it's just a desk, right? And that's really what you want to build from. So I think it's quite easy when you do this to have, like I've talked to people and the first thing they said was like, let's do the Boston bombing, or let's do a really powerful, and sometimes you have to say, well, okay, number one, you don't want to do crowds, right? Yeah. Number two, I would stay away from animation. I mean, we do some prosaic motion capture now, but it can look very uncanny valley very quickly. And not least to say that we're not actors, we're journalists. And number three, if that's a three, is like keep things simple, like really make things small. Because Ferguson, the Canfield Green Apartments complex is a large sprawling scene, and there are eyewitnesses everywhere. A lot of the users never make it to the. For example, there was a family in a minivan way off in the distance, and very few people even made it there because people are lazy in virtual reality as they are in real reality. So.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, guys, I think we might have to duck out. I promised Dan Archer I would feed him. He still has not had dinner yet. So, but if you have other questions that you think of, certainly follow up. I haven't gotten him to answer his speaker's questionnaire, which is the first time he's hearing about it.
Oh, great.
Yep. So we can certainly incorporate those into that, and then we'll publish it onto the blog.
Awesome.
Good luck with your project.